So Jeff has a kind of a long trajectory that hopefully I'm not going to stumble on here. So Jeff's PhD is in sociology. Jeff and I actually shared an advisor, although we didn't overlap too much, at the University of Toronto. And but this is actually a story of us kind of chasing each other through space and time here. So we were briefly together at the University of Toronto, and then after Jeff graduated, actually before he graduated, he did a pre-doc.
Yeah, pre-doc.
Grad students, you'll want to get in on that. He did a pre-doc at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard for a year with David Lazar and Jane Fountain. And then he left there, and then I went there.
Right.
And then Jeff went to Japan for 2 years, where he was in the Department of Social Psychology at the University of Toronto. Tokyo, sorry, yeah, Toronto, at the University of Tokyo.
Yeah.
And then following that was his postdoc. Following that, his first academic job was at Rutgers in the Department of Communication, where he was for about 3.5 years or so. And then he left there, and then I went there. And then he went back to Toronto.
I think I have a lot of influence on your life here.
I feel like there's like this interesting collision. So, and then you went to Ryerson in a Department of
Professional
Communication at Ryerson for a few years before, most recently, joining the University of Toronto.
4 years ago.
4 years ago, right. Okay, so what Jeff also doesn't know is that he's actually the co-author of one of my favorite papers of all time. I suspect he's not going to tell about it, but I had to point it out. Telecocooning, mobile texting, and social scope. And the reason I love this paper so much is because it brings together the intersection of networks and like the psychology of trust in a unique way. So
cool.
Jeff points out this really cool problem with using trust measures and how it varies unsystematically related to the kind of focus group of people, the focus of people's networks. Right? So anyway, I just had to point it out.
Thanks.
I love that
That's
paper
great.
so much.
Well, Tetsuro he was the first author on that.
Yeah, you get equal credit.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so with no ado, I give you Jeff votes.
Oh, good timing. I just unplugged my computer. All
right,
right.
so Jeff handed out these pieces of paper, and just as a reminder, if you have questions or comments, so this is a work in progress. This is the very earliest peek at Jeff's new research project, so he's extremely interested in any kind of feedback that you have, so do not be shy. You want to hit the button. Don't be shy about leaving comments, and then Jeff will just collect those at the end of the lecture. All right.
Thanks very much.
Maybe I have to push the button again.
No, it's okay. It just takes a moment. Good. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I know it's the end of the semester and things are very busy, so I really appreciate you making the time to come out. Do any of you have to be here because it's a class? Okay, I once said that it was like a class, and I was a little embarrassed. So thank you for coming. What I want to do is, I have a lot of stuff that I want to talk about, but more than that, I want to hear from you because, as Keith mentioned, I'm at this point where I've collected data. It's taken a long time to get this data. I've spent a long time organizing and getting all this data in R and doing certain things with it, which has been very time consuming. And so I have some results now. And as is the case so often with research, we start off going in with some ideas, and then sometimes the results are not what we expected. And so that's what happened with this data. And for me, that's not a problem, because I really treat social science as both inductive and deductive, right? I have my ideas orient me towards certain things and collecting data. I get that data, and sometimes it may not match my expectations, and I still have to make sense of it and figure that out. And in some ways, that's really good. Otherwise, why bother collecting data if it's just going to confirm what you thought all along? So what I want to do is I'll talk for a little bit about sort of the ideas orienting this project, very big picture stuff, very much influenced by my background in sociology. Then I'll get into the method that I use to collect the data, because I think it's a fairly unusual approach, and I'm frankly a little proud of it and how things have worked out, so I want to sort of show that off. But also I think you have to know the methods to then try and understand the results. And so then I'll go through some of the results, and I'll give you a flavor for the stuff that I've been finding. And then I want to sort of throw it open to you and say, well, what do you think is going on here, right? Okay, so big picture. So within sociology, anyone here in the sociology department or have a sociology background? Yeah, well, thanks. Do that. Within sociology, a lot of the current sort of influence, especially theoretically, and especially American sociology and other parts of the world, has come from trying to make sense of industrialization. Right? Before industrialization, you have a lot of people. They're often on farms. They spend a lot of time with the same people. Very frequent, regular interaction with the same people. Often they work with their family on the farm, so they're seeing the family, they're working with the family. They might go to the town, but they know a lot of the people there as well. And so their social lives are very stable and regular. There are some exceptions to that, for sure, but that was a pretty common pattern. Along comes industrialization, and suddenly there's the rise of large urban centers. And people will sleep at home and go to work. And then the people they interact with at work are not the people they're interacting with at home. So there's a separation of home and family. And then, of course, at the urban centers, you have more opportunity for people from very different backgrounds to interact, sometimes very briefly. And so people are often trying to understand that. And of course, at the core of that is technology, right? Industry is technology. And of course, then we have the development of transportation and communication infrastructures, which then facilitated more of this sort of interaction. And so I want to understand this sort of pattern. And so I'll talk about that, and then I'll get into what I think is kind of a paradox when we think about the mobile phone. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but basically, as I said, pre-industrial networks, very much frequent, regular contact with regular, sort of normal people that you're used to and you live with. And this has been termed the Gemeinschaft society by Tony, who's a sociologist, who's very influential. Along comes industrialization, you have a separation of family and work. Now, interactions can still be frequent and regular, but they're often with different sets of people. And over time, as people work a little bit less and have more spare time, there's interactions that can be even less frequent, like going to community groups or doing certain activities with people, and so on. This has been called the Gesellschaft society. And Tony's and a lot of other sociologists have talked about how this can be alienating for people and how it can be a problem. But ultimately, regardless of how people felt about it, when you just think of in terms of interaction, the patterns changed. Now, I'm a big fan of someone named Rose Lob-Kozer. Anyone heard of her? So she's a sociologist who is very much influenced by Robert K. Merton. Robert K. Merton, as you may have heard, as someone who's focused a lot on people's social roles. How you interact in different roles. How I interact with a father, as a father with my children is very much different than the way I interact with my colleagues and so on, right? And so, she argues that in industrialization, people have very complex role sets. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in some ways, it's a good thing because people have more autonomy to be creative in how they interact and so on. And so there seems to be this shift. And Kozer argues that with this complexity of role sets, it's not necessarily that people feel alienated. They actually just have more complex networks. And so this, of course, fits really nicely with a lot of work that's being done by people like Barry Wellman, who was my advisor and Keith's advisor, who look at technology, and they look at how people are actually interacting, and they find that people are using technology to maintain networks where they have a core group of people who are relatively close, but then they have a lot of people who are perhaps in the same city, but not within walking distance. And they use the telephone and transportation technology, and then eventually email and so on to maintain these kinds of relationships. And so this is sort of the sort of emerging pattern, what you might think of as a post-industrial kind of lifestyle. So now we have phones, email, social media, and all of these things seem to have supported this sort of type of diversity in networks insofar as you have people that you don't see all the time, right? That, maybe you have friends from high school, they're on Facebook, you have a sense of what they're doing, right? As Keith would say, this awareness and pervasive awareness. We had a little interaction with that a while ago. And so there's this awareness, but again, it's not necessarily a lot of frequency. But if they're in town for some reason, because you have kept up with them on Facebook, you might be more likely to send them a message, say, do you want to get coffee? Okay, so it's not a regular interaction, but there's interaction. And a lot of this interaction, often people end up meeting in person as well. But the mobile phone, I think, especially if you look at mobile phone scholarship within the area of communication, seems to be a little unusual. Because when you think about it, and a lot of research has shown, there's a lot of communication with just a few people, especially through text messaging, right? Or now through social media apps, right? So, a lot of this communication seems to be with people that you're living with or like really close friends, and you're texting them all during the day. And so that's, there's concern that perhaps if people are texting a lot of these small number of people, they're spending less time developing new and diverse relationships with other people. And maybe they're less aware of the place, right? They're on their phones, they're not aware of their surroundings, and they might miss opportunities to learn things about the world and about other people around them. So there's a lot of concern about that. Now, the results are not that consistent, but especially with smartphones, I think the idea that the mobile phone is causing people to bond in these little telecocoons has been sort of put away. We're not so worried about that anymore, because people on the mobile phones are still often using social media apps where they're connecting with people who are a little more diverse. It seems that even though they're looking at the phones, they can still manage in-person interactions. Now, there's still some debate about this, but overall, it's not as a looming concern as it used to be a few years ago. But nevertheless, Rich Ling, who I have worked with and I'm a big fan of, has made the case that still, when you think about it, there's a lot of interaction with people that you're very close to, especially through texting, right? And in some ways, it's kind of like a digital Gemini, right? It's kind of like going back in the old days where you have a lot of interaction with just a few people. Now, it's not exactly the same because we still have interaction with other people. We still go out. It's not saying that we're going back to a completely Gemini lifestyle, but at least with that small number of ties, we have a lot of constant connection throughout the day, and that is, a significantly different thing than what's happening with other technologies. Another thing he has done with other people at Telenor, which is this Norwegian telephone company. They have analysis of the texting data from that company. They don't have a lot of information in terms of, who they're looking at. They didn't have any surveys or other information on these people, but they just have their texting patterns. And they found that the vast majority of texts are with just 5 people. Right? So again, it really supports this idea of the digital Gemeinschaft. So this is kind of, in a way, a paradox, right? On the one hand, most communication technologies, especially contemporary ones, seem to support complex networks, right? Networks where these people, we don't see them all the time, but they're still there in our social world. And yet then the mobile phone seems to be used, especially texting, seems to be used a lot for these Gemeinschaft relationships. So what's going on there? Now, conceptually, one of my first past responses is, well, we know that a lot of communication technologies support both strong and weaker relationships. In other words, people do use email and phones to call the people they live with or email people they live with. Right? But they also use them for more diverse networks as well. And texting is just one of several media that exist on mobile phones now. With smartphones, they're multimedia devices, right? So you call, you text, you use social media apps, and you can consume media in other ways as well. So, overall, I wouldn't think of the mobile as this device that is necessarily used only to support these strong relationships. But nevertheless, it's still very interesting that texting seems to be something that is used for frequent and regular contact with a small number of people. So, aside from that Norway study where they found most texting is with just the top 5 ties, there hasn't been a lot of research that's actually looked at logged calling and texting patterns, because of course it's really difficult to get that kind of data. So a lot of research has focused on self-reports or interviews or observations. And so it may be missing something. So one thing I wanted to do is see, is it really true that this texting is with a small number of people? So I sort of wanted to confirm that finding. And if so, why might this be happening? Why is texting more frequent and regular? So, I have also some ideas about that. And these are the ideas that I actually didn't find a lot of support for in my first pass of the data, but I haven't spent a lot of time analyzing it, so I'm not dismissing them quite yet. but I'll tell you what I thought was maybe happening is that, when you think of these shifts, from pre-industrial to industrial, and now what you might think of as post-industrial, right? If you look at the family, there seems to be a change in family, a progressing change where, now there's increasing divorce, longer time until marriage, more people living alone, and people having fewer children, right? So in other words, kin structures are less stable than they used to be, right? So even though there might be a lot of frequent contact in a block of time, like a few years with, say, a spouse, then there might be divorce, right? And then there may be another spouse a few years after that, right? So there's the general change towards a sort of less frequent, less regular interaction over long periods of time. Looking at the work environments that people are in, people switch careers a lot more often. There's a lot more temporary employment. There's a lot more, there are less stable work hours, and there's more work at home. So again, it seems like these work institutions also are less stable than they used to be, especially for younger generations of people. So, these trends might actually explain perhaps in some ways why there is this frequent texting, because if you have, say, for example, a workplace where you don't have high expectations of staying there, and you don't have regular hours, then if you do have someone who's really close to you, say in your family, or someone who's you're romantically involved with, then you might be able to text them more during the day, because at work you have total freedom, or there's less obligation, or you're less invested in it. Alternatively, if you live alone, or you're not in relationships that are sort of traditional, and your work is something that's really strong in your life, then maybe it's more likely to seep over into your home life. Maybe you're more likely to do work at home and to respond to text messages about work-related issues and so on, if things are sort of less traditional in your family life. So this is just an idea that I had, trying to unravel this. So let's just try and hold those ideas in mind if we can for a moment. Now I'm going to shift over to the methods and how I tried to collect some data on this stuff, and then I'll give you some results, and we'll circle back at the end. So, one of the methodological problems, as I mentioned earlier, is that a lot of studies are about behavior, right? Like social interaction is behavior. It's not what you think happened, it's what happened. And behavior is complex, and it occurs over time. But, traditional self-report measures like, asking someone, how many people did you call yesterday? Basically lump a lot of behavior into just one time period, and they have a lot of problems with validity. A lot of people are just bad at telling you what they've done. They over-report because maybe they feel like insecure about the fact that they're not all that social and so on. So I have a couple of papers basically showing what I just said. I won't get into it, but it's an issue. Smartphones, on the one hand, seem like these devices that can be new avenues for data collection, because for a lot of people, they're the only electronic device they have. They don't have computers sometimes. They just only have mobile phones. And that's where a lot of their communication occurs through. So they can do email on the mobiles, they can text, they can use social media and so on. So I developed a data collection system, and I got funding through the Canadian government to do this, and I worked with these wonderful people up here. And this system, I'm going to tell you about it even though this current version of it is no longer operational because Google changed its policy. Fortunately, after I collect all my data. But hopefully it's something that may be interesting to people here, because you might find that you could do a similar approach with other kinds of data. So I'll just briefly explain how it works. So in the system, we had what I would call a researcher portal, which is a website, and only researchers who I give passwords to are allowed to use it. And once they're in that website, they set up basically the actions that happen on an Android app, which we call the eRhythms app. And with this app, anyone can download it, but they need an ID, participant ID, in order to actually use it. And so basically the idea is you recruit people however you want. You set up the app to work with that group of people, and then you give them a set of IDs, and only those people who have the IDs can actually use the app. The app was designed to both collect calling and texting data from the histories of the mobile phones, and also administer on-screen questions if you wanted it to do that. Now, very important, first of all, we told everyone who participated exactly how the app worked, what it would do. We gave pictures and so on. I'll explain that in a moment. So it was complete informed consent. This is not something we're trying to sneak in, like steal people's data. And we also had a process of trying to anonymize the data so that we wouldn't have identifying information. So this is just an example of what it looked like. So you can see here, this is a hash, which is a way of basically concealing or masking the phone number. So might be the respondent's phone number. Then these would be the phone numbers of the people in their calling and texting history. This would be if in the address book, it was labeled as like a mobile phone or a home address or whatever. If it was calling, you'd have the duration, you'd have the time and date, the time zone. It's not actually the city, it's just the time zone. And if it was outgoing, incoming. So we had that for calling and texting. We didn't get any of the content of the text messages. I didn't want it. It's too ethically questionable for sure. So no, none of the messages, none of the pictures, nothing like that. Just the time and dates. And one of the important functions of this is that once they installed it, we could ask questions where we'd ask them to identify people in their address book, and then those people, the hash associated with those people would be saved as an answer to the question. So here is an example of how it works. So you install it, you have to put in your participant ID, there's informed consent, explains how it works. We also had other informed consent and other media as well. You start it up, and then this was just an example question. Select the name of a person with whom you enjoy discussing political or social issues. They could then select that person from their address book or their call log. And then that hash ID would be saved as their response. Okay, so we've used this to collect data in a lot of different ways. In-depth interviews, experimental design, organization, blah, blah, blah. And the problem is, when I really wanted to get a national sample, I went to a number of research companies in Toronto, and I was not at all happy with the methods that they were using. Often they had like panel data where they had a set of people who agreed to participate in their studies if they paid the money. But then they weren't upfront about how did you get those people to say that they would participate in your studies? What was the response rate? How were they recruited? Nothing, nothing, nothing. They don't want to tell us. So it's probably just like whoever they could get in whatever way. And so even though you could pull out a sample of that who are demographically like the rest of Canadians, there's still that more fundamental sampling bias to contend with. And so I think in certain ways, those panels, I don't want to put them down completely because I think they can be useful, especially where there's been a lot of research with using them. But in this case, I wasn't very happy with it. So I decided to think about other methods. There's telephone recruiting, but then with an app, isn't that a little difficult? You call someone, would you like to install an app? Okay, how do I do that, right? So that wasn't going to work. And mailed surveys, we know they have low responses, but that's the old school where you like mail pieces of paper, ask people to fill them out, and then mail them back to you. What about new methods? I talked to people in the Netherlands who said that they were able to get pretty good response rates where they mail out an invitation and people install an app and do a survey. So I was like, well, that's worth a shot. I had really low expectations. I wanted to try. So basically, we had a national database of Canadian addresses. It was quite comprehensive, millions and millions, randomly selected from there. And then we sent a letter on letterhead describing the study, frequently asked questions. This is like double-sided, like why are you doing this study? What does the log data look like? Blah, blah, blah. Enough detail about trying to make it really clear and accessible. We even tried an infographic, but that didn't seem to help response rates. And then simple instructions about how you install. Tried different batches of incentives. So started with like no incentive and then worked our way up to $50. Not surprising, $50 had the most responses. However, it wasn't like a linear relationship. It wasn't like one-to-one. It was like once you got past like 30, 40, then it's like, ooh, now it's taking off. So we ended up settling on 50 for this sample. And so within Canada, of course, there's this province called Quebec where people speak French. We didn't have a French version of the app, so we didn't include the Quebecers. I'm bad. I know you guys don't care, but others will. So, so this is the national sample. We ended up getting 409 adults. could have gotten more, but it was getting expensive. Not only, so, there's the price of like the incentive, then there's like the stationery and paying people to stuff envelopes, and then I was actually sending money orders for every single person for $50 through my bank account. So that was a lot of work there. And we also gave them the option of not only getting like cash through an e-transfer, but also they could donate it to a charity, or they could, what was the other one? Amazon gift card. And so the response rate, when you consider the percentage of Android users in Canada, which is like, there are 85% are smartphone users, and then 40% of those are Android users. Then we had about a 9% response rate, which is kind of on par with telephone polling these days. Now, still there could be biases, right? Because these are smartphone users, so they could be, highly skilled, high trust, and so on. So, what about iPhone users? We couldn't develop this app for the iPhone because the iPhone wouldn't allow us to collect this kind of data. So we had another sample of 106 people who, in this sample, we did everything the same, but we didn't ask them to install an app. We did an online survey. And in the online survey, we had all the same questions as we did in the app survey. So we could compare and look for any kind of bias in the responses. So those are the things I'm going to focus on today. Very briefly, we also did in-depth interviews with 50 adults where we asked them to install the app. And then we had the same kind of questions we had in the survey, but we had like follow-up questions. So like, identify someone who's a very close friend. Tell me about this person, like in a very open-ended kind of way. Then we also did a number of samples with teenagers. I won't even get into that, but they're there if anyone wants to talk about it later. From the adult sample, going that 400 set of people, there were 2.2 million calls and texts from the logged data that we were able to gather, and 44,000 ties or devices were contacted. Then when you compare the variables between the app national sample and the online survey national sample, as I said, they're all the same kind of questions. Did a comparison of 163 variables. There were very few differences overall. Main differences were age, education, so those were the key variables that I compared. The main differences were age. So the app people were about, 7 years younger on average. And overall, that was the main difference between those two things. Then if you compare it to the census, these are again just the app people. Age is a little bit lower, but not like crazy low, like it's 33. It's not bad. So we had a pretty good range of people. We had people in their 70s, even a couple in their 80s. Gender was pretty much on par. Education, a little bit higher education in the app. We had like 27% were undergrad holders, whereas in the census it's 17%. But again, we had a range of people. And then in terms of employment, pretty similar. So overall, I didn't see a lot of evidence of systematic bias in terms of the response, except for the age thing, which is kind of what you expect for app users. Anyone have any comments or questions on that so far? Okay. So I'm going to zoom through some of these results, and then we'll have some time for talking. So I got to tell you, this was a lot of work to get this data, because not only did I have these like 5 different samples, but then there's multi-level, because you have the event level, every call and text is an event. Then those are with devices, which are like social ties, so that's a tie level. And then you have the respondent level, right? So all of this data needs to be like working together, consistently coded and so on. I also learned R for the first time. That made life really fun. But I'm pretty happy I did it, because there's a lot of stuff I couldn't even do in this data. So here's just a sense of what I was working with. So even just preparing the data, like how do you analyze this? It's pretty messy when you think about it. Like with log data, it's not like everyone has the same time where they started recording calls and texts in their logs, right? So from this national survey, a lot of people installed the app in February and April. And that's when most of the people installed the app, but there's still a few stragglers up until May. And the last person was August, which was really weird, but most people were done by May. And then the duration of the log data is anywhere between 7 days. They need at least 7 days in order to do the survey. That was something the app was set up for. But then the median number of days was close to 300. Okay, but then within the third quartile, you have like 2 years of log data. So in other words, some people have log data that's years and months long, and other people have log data that's a few weeks and so on. So how do you reconcile that? Because if you're looking for patterns over time, it could be apples and oranges, right? If I look at, for example, I want to look at like the average number of calls with someone who's a very close friend. Well, if you have 7 days of logged history, can you really say that average is the same as 700 days of logged history? It's not the same. Right? How do you deal with that when you're analyzing the log data? Then there's the thing which I'm sure you've already thought of, social media apps. I'm looking at texting to the default app. Right? What about all these other social media apps? I'm not capturing that. And especially like when I was in, where was it, Germany, they're like, how could you even do this research? Everyone uses WhatsApp. Well, fortunately in Canada, texting became part of basic phone plans earlier than a lot of other countries. And so a lot of people use the default texting app. And so if you look at this, nearly half just only use the default app as the most heavily used app for texting. Then Facebook Messenger, close to 20% use that as the most, what they use the most to send text messages. Then WhatsApp at 17%, Snapchat, and so on. So what I did was, if you look at the average number of texts per day of each of those, the interesting thing is you got 10 for the people who say default is used the most, about the same for Facebook Messenger people. WhatsApp is about half of that. So it implies to me probably that WhatsApp is basically used as a substitute for a lot of people instead of the default app. They still do use the default app, right? There's some activity there. Whereas Facebook Messenger may be more supplementing. In other words, adding on with particular kind of ties. And when we did the interviews with the adolescents, we found just that. They said like, well, you know, I'll use Snapchat or something like just for fun with a friend because that's kind of what we do once in a while. But if I want to get someone's attention, I'll use the default app because it definitely will like pop up on their phone. You don't have to worry about the settings of the app. It'll always be. And so it seems like there's this kind of specialization, which is an interesting finding in itself. Anyways, going back to the implications for analysis, what I decided to do was I created a dummy variable for people who are WhatsApp users. So in multivariate models, I can control for that. And there's 17% of the sample. So there's maybe some influence, but I don't think it's enough to like invalidate a lot of these other findings. I'm going to spend more time with the qualitative interviews to try and think about this a little bit more. Anyone have comments or questions on that so far?
I have questions. So
yeah.
when I look at the data, low data, after their max number is over 2,000, what is mean that number? To me, it's kind of something error in your data, or
So which max number?
could you go back to the
Yeah.
that one, the max number?
That's max number. Oh,
I think before this one. Yeah, low data duration. The max number is 2,454. What is
well, these are days.
days, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
So that's like 4 years or something.
4 years.
Yeah, and it's not surprising. Some people keep their phones, and also Android will copy over log data when you change devices now. So if they, recently changed to a new phone, but they had an older phone with like 3 years of history, it would actually copy that over. However, that is a good point because with calling, there is a max number that Android allows. I think it's like 200 calls or something. So that's something that when I get into the calling data, I won't talk about it today, but you have to keep that in mind.
So you never you never clean the data set. You just use the older data set.
Well, I'm getting there. I'm talking about the prep. So this is how I'm dealing with the social media app stuff. But still, as I mentioned, there's this apples and oranges problem. Like some people have short amounts, some people have long amounts. So this is something that I'm still chewing on. I'll tell you what I've done for the analysis I'll talk about today, but I'm really open to your suggestions. What I decided to do is I don't want to average out over a number of days. So what could we do if we sort of look at choosing enough duration that it seems theoretically significant, but we might lose some people. So if I was looking at the breakdown of the days in log history, so 10% of the people have 35 days or less, right? 30% have 150 days or less. I decided to go for 56 days, which is 2 months basically, 8 weeks. And then I lost 13.5% of the people in the analysis when I was looking at the long history. So that's how I decided to deal with it for now, because that way 2 months is a significant period of time. The other thing about that is when you keep in mind the install dates, that way we don't overlap with holidays, because holidays could really throw off patterns, because all the people installed February or later. So that's one of the, if you have ideas, you want to write them down, then you could also do that. All right, so let's get through some of the results, and then we'll have some more time to talk. So if we look at texting frequency, as you expect, there's this skewed distribution. We find this a lot in any kind of logged data. There's a few people who have a lot of activity, and then a lot of other people are sort of like not as much comparatively. And so the median number of texts in 56 days is about 10. Now, I'm summing, this is really weird for people. What I have to do is sum up the number of texts over 56 days for these 400 people, right? And that gives us this median of like 527. But that's kind of hard to wrap our heads around, so I want to do like an average a day. So you can take the average number of people for 56 days, but then that average will vary across the set of people. So then do you take the average of the average, which would be the mean, or you can take the median of the average? I tend to take the median because we have this skewed distribution. So it's the median of the average or mean number of days. So just like a heads up about why this seems weird. And we can also talk about if you have other ideas on how to deal with that. But it just makes things a little more comprehensible, I think, in terms of averaging out per day. So let's look at the most texted ties. So I ranked ties based on the number of texts over 56 days. And the most texted tie had about 4 texts per day. And then the mean was about 8. This right here actually I think is a very important finding. What it means is, and especially coupled with this finding, people are not spending all their lives texting a few people. How long does it take to send 5 or 10 text messages? Not that long. Now, there is a smaller set of people who are doing a lot of texting, and they will spend a lot of time on it. But for most people, most of the time, they're not absorbed in texting all the time. But if you look at the mobile phone literature, you get the sense that everyone's texting all the time, right? Because, of course, that's something that people want to focus on. But the reality is, texting is important to people, it's used regularly, but it's not like a huge time suck. Going back to the most texted ties, so you have a lot of texting with the highest ranked tie, then it goes down, right? And drops down. But this really comprises the bulk of text that people send. So this is very similar to what Rich Ling found with the Norwegian data. Then I'm interested in regularity. Regularity is really difficult to measure because it's a fuzzy concept. Are you communicating with someone regularly? So here are some things that I've done, and again, I'm open to other suggestions. I've had interesting conversations with people about how to do this. As someone who doesn't come from computer science, I'm trying to walk the line of doing something that makes sense, but will not be like a huge encompassing task. So one thing is to look at the median number of minutes between texts, and then thinking about text sessions, which are like, if you have one day where there's texting, I consider that a session. So in other words, how much time is between texting. And so in general, it's about every 2 days there's texting. And then if you think about the standard deviation, right, the standard deviation really gets to the regularity of that. Right? So if there's a high standard deviation, that means that sometimes there's big gaps between texting sessions. And so this shows, I would say this is a fairly high standard deviation. So texting is not super regular. Then we can also think about texting over days of the week. Are there certain days where people text a lot? And if you look at this, it's like there's a bit more texting on Friday, but otherwise it's and a little bit less on Saturday, but for the most part it's pretty consistent, and a lot less on Sunday. So there's like, again, this sort of like activity ramps up Friday because it's a social time, and then it sort of goes down on the weekends. And you can also break it down by time of day. Is there more texting during certain times of day? Well, there's a lot of texting in the afternoon and evening. Now, okay, so this is one way of approaching it. I still think that that is pretty limiting in terms of looking at regularity. So I was thinking of ways of trying to look at these patterns and see if they sort of clump up on certain categories, on certain days of the week or certain times of day. So anyone heard of the index of qualitative variation? It's kind of like what we call an entropy measure. Okay, it's a sort of more simple version of that. And so this is sort of the first thing I did to try and get at the clumpiness of it. And so it's really ideal because it doesn't assume like there is an ordering to these things. It really is allowing you to look at whether or not things load on particular categories. And there are many other approaches to this, but I decided on this one because it's the most easy to understand. It's a fairly simple equation, which I could talk about if you want. And so just to give you a sense, we remember the days of the week. It was a little more clumpy on like Fridays, a little more loaded on Fridays, a little less on Sundays. So the IQV there was like 97.5. Okay, so it's fairly high. Time of day, you remember there's a lot less during the nighttime, not surprising. So that's 85. So this gives you a sense of what this looks like. Now, I still find that limiting. So what I decided to do is for each tie, looking at calculating the IQV over the last 8 weeks. So in other words, I made a variable for each day of the week. And then I looked at communications occurring on each day of the week and put them in each variable. And then I calculated the IQV over 8 weeks. So this really gets at, is there regular contact over 8 weeks, or does it all clump up in like certain weeks? And see if that varies by tie ranking. Okay, so this is the highest ranked tie. This is, you can look at the median days between sessions, the standard deviation of meeting days, days of the week, time of day, and last 8 weeks for IQV. Okay? Now, if we compare that to second ranked ties, third ranked ties, not surprisingly, things become a little less regular overall, going down less and less regular. Right? So in other words, the most frequently contacted ties are also the most regularly contacted ties. So just to summarize so far, this is sort of like support for the digital Gemini shaft idea. Small number of people, frequent and regular texting. And since I'm running low on time, I'm just going to go a little faster and just give you a few more results, and then we'll stop. So who are these people that are being texted? In the survey, we asked people to identify particular kinds of ties. So we asked them to identify someone you live with, someone who's a very close friend outside the home, someone who helped you with something important, someone who's a somewhat close friend outside the home, someone you work with, and someone with very different political views. So we're basically getting variations on tie strength, network diversity, and also looking at live with and work with and thinking about home and family life. Sorry, home and work life. And so these are like the number of texts per day, and looking at sort of the average ranking. So like someone you live with has overall the highest ranking. They're more likely to be the highest ranked tie. Right? They're on average is like 2. When you get down to here, they have a much lower ranking, not surprising. Is this making sense so far? We also asked questions in the survey about how they communicate by other means, not to be too text-centric. I just highlighted where more than 50% of the respondents said they communicated with those ties in the last 7 days by medium. And you can see in-person, of course, dominates. Email, not at all. Phone calls are pretty important still, and texting is still very important. You'll notice social media direct messaging for the very close friend is close to 50, so it's relatively important, but less important for these other things. So again, like social media direct texting is important, especially for close friends, but it's not the dominant thing for sure.
So Jeff, are you controlling for age anywhere in this?
Well, yeah, I'm going to get to the multivariate, but actually, I sort of feel like right now I just want to see what are the patterns here, like who is texting the most before we get into the why of it. So then I'm going to skip this. Basically, what I'll say is when I looked at different types of home arrangements and work arrangements, I didn't find a lot of associations with texting patterns. So it doesn't matter if you're in like a really traditional job with regular hours or you're not working at all. It doesn't matter if you live alone or you live with children. There's some associations, like living with children, those people tend to have a bit more texting, probably because they're using texting with the children to keep tabs on them. But overall, there's not like huge differences there, which is kind of contrary to what I expected and what I talked about at the beginning. So overall, there's sort of limited support, I think, for this digital Gemeinschaft thing. There is a lot of frequent regular texting with a small number of ties, but it tends to be people that you live with and you feel close to. But overall, this texting is still not really heavy. It's not like you're texting these people all the time. It's like 5 texts a day. Or, it depends on the person, it could be a bit more. But it's just not super duper heavy. And the home life and the work life don't seem to really explain that to a large extent. But there's one unexpected result, which I save for the end. This to me is one of the most interesting findings here. And I've done the analysis a few times. I've spent a lot of time looking at this data. I don't think this is a coding error. So in the last 56 days, the median number of ties to whom there are outgoing messages, in other words, you're sending messages, how many different people do you send messages to, is 15. That seems high to me. The median number of outgoing and incoming is like 20. So that means that's probably spam, the people you're not texting back, or maybe there's something else going on there. But 15, it's more than 5, right? Even though most of the communication is 5, there's still this other set of people that are weaker relationships probably, or just not texting dominant relationships. And that seems significant. If you think about it in your regular life, I spend most of the time with my kids and my wife, but I still have very important relationships that are very infrequently contacted in person. Right? So if you were to break down my communication in person, it might actually have a very similar kind of pattern. So it makes me wonder about this whole digital Gemeinschaft thing, and maybe texting actually is pretty important for maintaining different kinds of relationships in different ways. It's just people haven't focused on it because there hasn't been a lot of data on that, and it's harder for people to remember in surveys and so on. So that's just, that's all I'll say about that. I won't even get into future directions. We'll just leave it at that. So, I'd love to hear from you.
Questions? First, I'm sorry, you were absent for Johannes' direction. The first question must come from a student.
Please.
So with there's a lot of frequency of texting with people you live with. You see sort of variations in the days of the week, so there's a lot on Friday. To me, this sort of indicates it's sort of like micro-coordination.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So if you had sort of like what were these texts about, you might discover it's a lot of, can you go get the groceries, what time are we going out, micro-coordination with people you're close with.
Right. Yeah, and Ling does talk about that as well. I mean, the micro-coordination means that there's ultimately also in person, and so that even though the micro-coordination, or sort of even though texts are not about like, oh, I miss you so much, I love you so much, right? It's still a kind of frequent interaction. And even going back to the Gemeinschaft, pre-industrial times, people wouldn't necessarily love the people they work with, or want to just like reach out to them and be close. It's like they had to do stuff together. They had to like fill the fields or whatever. Right? So. Yeah, I think that's a good insight. And we do have like self-report questions on generally what they text about, so I will get into that a bit more and see if that's associated with that sort of thing.
So I have a comment about this unexpected result.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that median number is a little bit high. So just from my own observation, who I text to, so how can you identify some more functional use? I text many things to my doctors. So I guess a lot of clinics and maybe other types of small business or the things, my kids' class, like karate class, they always use these texting surveys to, I don't know if that's true in Canada, but that might explain why the median number is higher than, just the close core network.
Okay. So in other words, like the more organizations that you're
organizations.
And will people text back to the organizations?
Yeah, so usually they say, you have an appointment on this day. Are you going to attend? Please reply yes.
Right.
Or here is an event, extra event. Are you coming? Then yes, something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I do have some stuff in the survey getting at that kind of thing, and maybe the interview. So I'll look for that. Thank you. That's good idea.
I wonder if you'd also be able to, I know the phone numbers were encrypted.
Mm-hmm. They were hashed consistently across devices, so we could look to see if there are common numbers
Yeah, common, like even regionally based, kind of nested
Yep.
doctor's offices,
Yeah.
stuff like that. Though it wouldn't capture things like, so I was going through my text when we were talking, and things like, I mean, there's a neighbor who we carpool with for tennis lessons and stuff like that, but we're not close to.
Yep.
But it's an instrumental
Yeah,
organizational
right.
kind of task.
Yeah.
And I think that's still that's really significant as well, right? Like if you're communicating with people because your core activities through an organization or a larger set, that indicates more diverse networks, more what people could maybe consider bridging capital. I don't really love that term, but that sort of type of diversity which we wouldn't expect based on the mobile literature at all. Yeah.
Going back to the age question, because
Mhm.
I mean, you just assume there must be age-related results. Like
Mhm.
you looked at teenagers versus adults. Is there differences?
Well, the teen data, I haven't done a direct comparison with the log data. Although just even knowing the numbers, yeah, there's more texting among younger people. I did look at age with some of these basic variables, and it's associated, but it's not like a super crazy strong association that explains everything. It's like when I did multivariate models predicting to frequency of texting, I had age in there, and it was like the p-value was like 0.06 or something. So
Were you looking at age as a
Yeah.
continuous variable, or are you looking
yeah, so
at
I
generational
will get into it
cohorts?
in more detail for sure.
Yeah.
But the age, the good thing is we have a number of people who are in their 50s, 60s, and so on. So I'll see if that does have more influence. But I think it will be significant for sure. But I don't know if it's going to necessarily. Yeah, depending on what I'm looking at. Like it will be related to home and work life and so on. I think there'll be a lot of texting among middle-aged people who have children. That was a big influence. Yes?
So for this one, did you control the when the message or the text happens? So even during the private time or during the public time in the day
Yeah,
or
so
at night?
this is one thing I will spend more time on. I have questions in the survey about what time you start work and end work.
Mhm.
So then I classify texts that happen during work hours or not. And so I want to do a little more with that. Just needs a little more time.
Yeah. One more little thing that I noticed. So in the data that you have log data, you have the address label, address book label, so
Yeah.
they can label whether it's home
Right.
or other things. Have you analyzed the data relying on that information?
You know what, not with this data, but with a previous data set, which was a similar setup, I did. And we had like survey questions that would help us know if it was really a home or home device or mobile device or whatever. That wasn't too helpful because people, I don't
Yeah,
think they
they
actually
don't. They
maintain
just-
their address books very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're just kind of lazy, so it's,
And Casey has a question. You may not see him. He's sitting down back there.
So actually, two things. I'm super curious about this age element too, but also as it relates to partnered, unpartnered individuals, right?
You mean
Because
like people who are-
you might have different levels of coordination happening. It's like or this is somebody you don't live with, but maybe you have a romantic relationship with, and so the level of texting. It also makes me like apparently I spend way too many texts. I was also thinking about like Dunbar's number, and so like we sort of 5 really close people in our lives is that sort of magic number, which kind of fits with what you're talking about. But then 10 and 15, and then sort of outside of that, it really does drop off. So do you see that connection too?
yeah, I mean with Dunbar, so I haven't spent a lot of time with his work, so I don't remember what he was saying about. Did he talk about 5 ties or?
Yeah, 5 is your inner circle of close friends and family,
Right.
and then your second circle is got 10 people, which are again people that you're closer to, friends and family, and then outside of that, you stand up whether you're introvert or extrovert,
Right.
10, 35.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that, so I'll have to spend some time looking at that. Thanks.
All right. Oh, one. Okay. Ken gets the last question. Go ahead.
Are you looking at the length of the message in any way?
Yeah, we have the number of characters in the message. Do you think, how would that be?
Because I'm curious if there's a relationship between how the ranking number and the length of the text.
Okay, yes.
And I'm also wondering if the ranking number, can that change over the course of time? If there's somebody,
Yes, I want to really look at that.
Okay.
That's a really
somebody that I really need to talk to for a week, and then like they're fixing my house or something, and then they're out.
Right. Yes. So, yeah, I was talking to Josh about this morning. Like, I think that's something that, you know, on the one hand, it's harder. Like, if I'm only using this 2-month thing, but if I'm going to spend some time looking to see if people have longer history tend to have like demographic biases or things like that, and if they don't, I want to go back as much as I can in the log history and look for these kinds of things over time. So does rank change? Does regularity of interaction change over different durations of time and so on? That'll be really interesting.
Very good. Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.